All right. So continuing with the creation of this. So for the terrain geometry, when I say that I, quickly bang out these things in Maya, what I mean is I just go and create a plane, although I need construction history on, so let me turn that on. So I create a plane, increase the divisions on it, let's say to 100 by 100, scale this thing up, and then once it's scaled up, go to polygons, mesh, sculpt geometry, and then usually I only sculpt on the y-axis, so if polys only go up and down. If you do it along the normal, you're going to get geometry kind of going through itself and crinkling up, and don't like that. So in here, what I need to do is, oops, let's do that again. Sculpt geometry. The B key, if you hold down the letter B, changes the radius. So if I sculpt, it's not doing much. I have to increase the max displacement a lot, like 300. So now I can see an effect. And then you can choose, obviously, if you want, something very hard or soft, like I use. So let me put this to like 500. So going in now and creating a terrain, obviously you can do this in ZBrush. But I find that, in ZBrush, I have to go to ZBrush. Here I'm in Maya. And for something like just a simple terrain object to grow trees off, it's kind of fine. And I don't necessarily need to put a lot of detail into it because of the fact that it's all going to get covered with plants and trees. So it's just the overall form and shape that I'm going for. So in here, and then now maybe I'll lower the max displacement down a little bit more. So it's kind of really cool to be able to do this in Maya. So I know it's maybe, with the days of ZBrush, it's maybe a little bit undervalued. But you can see that now I've got this quick little terrain, and I can sculpt it in Maya with a real camera, with real, perspective as opposed to ZBrush. So, it's kind of awesome to be able to sculpt to your actual render camera. And there you go. So that's how I create these surfaces. So if I delete that one and get the one from this scene back, no, this one, yeah. Then what I've got in here at this point, after creating the simple geometry, is I select the geometry and then just go under Dynamics, Particles, Emit from Object. I choose a surface emitter with a crazy high rate and put the speed to 0. And when you do that and you rewind and hit play, your surface will start to emit particles. I'm not going to get super involved into all the instancer stuff, just because that's thoroughly talked about in DVD2. But just so you know, as a review, that's how it's done. You get particles, and then you can select all your trees and go to the instancer tool. And in here, just select which particle object you want to stick all of these trees and hit create. And it will create an instancer node so that if I rewind and hit play, I get a whole bunch of trees. So I have my trees right now set to, or the instancer node, set to bounding box mode. If I set it to geometry, then we're going to actually see the geometry of those trees. So this we can see is kind of heavy right now, 255,000 polys, or 255 million polys. And so that's why bounding box mode is useful, so that you can still tumble around in real time. So I can see there are the instance trees. And if I go back to the instancer and switch it to bounding boxes, we can see that I can tumble no problem, even though there's 255 million polys. So, and like I've mentioned, this renders no problem. If I rewind to frame 1, all of these trees in here that are hidden right now, if I make them visible, we can see are 3.5 million polys. And that's all that's going to be used at render time. So I can instance copy these as many times as I want, and I'm going to be able to render this and not run out of RAM, up to a point. And that point on my machine with 12 gigs of RAM is about 700 million polys. And then it starts to act a little wonky. And then I would have to switch to mental ray proxies, which we'll talk about later. So I always use instances until I would need to switch to proxies at that point. But anything that I can render in RAM, I prefer to do it with instances because I can see the geometry, which I like. So at this point with this scene, if I go to the render view window, and let me shrink it down a little bit because it just opened huge on my other monitor. So I work obviously with a dual monitor setup. So my main monitor is a Wacom 24 HD something. It's the new big Wacom display, which is really cool. And so just because it's a much better color, so much more like a normal monitor, and it's big. And then my second monitor is a Dell 27-inch monitor that runs at 2560 by 1400 or something really high res. So I have two big monitors in front of me. And so I'm going to open image and see if I can find the render that would be from this scene. And that would be treetops. This, yeah. So that's the scene that we currently have open. I think we looked at this render before. But so the trees that I exported from Onyx and created the materials for, emit them onto the surface via particles in the instancer. I randomize the rotation in Y. I randomize the scale a little bit via the particle instancer, and then added a little fog in the scene and rendered. And so 255 million polys. And so we can see that you know, it looks neat, but I obviously decided to continue working on this scene and just try and go a little bit further with it. So let's go to the next save, which would be Onyx Trees 04. So Onyx Trees B04. And let's see what happened. At this point, I probably would have modeled the highway. Yeah. All right. So at this point, I've created the street or highway geometry, as we can see. And so that's based off two curves. So if I just do a view selected, we can see I created this curve here at the origin. So it just kind of rises up at the sides, and created this curve and did an extrude. And that created this extruded surface right here. And so this is NURBS, which is fine. The nice thing with NURBS is they have auto UVs. So meaning that you don't have to UV a NURBS object. And so all NURBS objects are a patch, which is a square that's four-sided, and the UVs fill that square in U and V. So that's very convenient for something like a road, because then obviously I know that the UVs will nicely curve with the geometry, and I don't need to worry about it. So that's the highway. But when you create an extruded surface like this, obviously the vertex spacing or the point spacing that's on the curve needs to be, needs to be consistent, because the spacing of the geometry that's created is based on the spacing of the vertices on the curve. So I just made sure to keep it relatively smooth. And once I created that geometry for the highway, I then went in with the Sculpt Geometry tool and then just sculpted along the edges so that it would kind of intersect, right along the edge there. Again, not worrying about a sloppy intersection because I would cover it with plants. So if I rewind and hit play at this point, I can see that I've got my instancer node off for the trees. So if I go and turn it on, we can see at this point I have created a texture so that my trees don't emit where the highway is. And so on my terrain geometry that has an emitter node on it, if I go to the attribute editor, I can see that on this emitter I've got enable texture rate on, and I have a texture mapped to texture rate, which is this texture. And so wherever is white is where it emits particles. And I created this texture in Maya using the texture paint tool, which is under texturing 3D paint. So again, whenever I can stay in Maya, I like to. And creating nice textures for objects with this is not a recommended thing because it's not great. But for black and white textures to emit particles on a surface, it's awesome. So I use that just to create that simple black and white map. So, you know, I'm very tempted as I record to like really get into all the details of everything, but then, you know, it's covered so thoroughly in other DVDs that this DVD would end up being 20 hours long. So hopefully you've been following along and have seen those other DVDs. And if you haven't, you know, and you don't know how to use the instancer, it's pretty straightforward, but there's a bunch of specific things you're going to want to need to know how to do. That said, that's what's going on in here at this point. So I can see that I also have another particle object in here. So let's go and take the trees and turn them off. And let's take the particle object for the trees and hide that too. And then this particle object that's inside here is probably on this highway. Let's grab the extruded surface. And we can see that I also got that to emit particles. So this surface here is also an emitter, emitting into particle 2. So if I rewind and hit play, and I select that particle object, you can see I have particles that are emitting off the edge of the road. And so that's super easy because on my emitter node, again, you can see texture rate is on, and then I have a texture which is just a ramp. So let's say we get those particles to be easier to see for a second. So I'm going to go to the particle shape node and turn them into little spheres. And I'm going to make those spheres bigger. And that doesn't want to go higher than 10, but that's fine. So I can see those a little bit easier. So if I go to my emitter and I go to this ramp that I put on the rate, I can rewind and hit play. And let's put this to, let's say, just 20 frames. And you can see that as I change this texture, I can make an adjustment. So I can say, well, the particles on the left edge here, you can see just hug the edge, but the ones on the right go in a little bit further. Or I can go and adjust that. So it's pretty awesome and interactive. And then also I could go and introduce noise into this. So if I stop playback, you can see the little texture swatch in the upper left here. You can add noise into that, and the particle object will respect that. So let's say I go to my emitter, or rather, my emitter right now is set to a rate, let's say, of 5 million. But my particle object is set to have only 1,000 particles in it. So that's why my particles just sort of pop on at frame 1. But if I put the max count to 5,000 and rewind and hit play, now I'll have 5,000 particles. And so I can now go in here and I can mess around and just have a little bit easier visualization of how that noise is being affected. So now I have more particles in the center, or rather on the edges, and less in the center, with a nice noisy fall off along that edge. So that's all of the sort of grasses and plants that are along the edge of the highway. And then also, let's see in Hypershade if I'd thrown a texture on the road yet. I did. And that's just a very simple texture that I grabbed probably at CG Textures. And with this texture, just wait for it to wake up. Wake up. Okay. It's obviously a tileable texture that tiles just in one direction. It tiles vertically. And so that's how I need it for my road. And this photographic texture has some sort of grass and plants along the edge, which works well. It gets covered with my CG plants, but it's nice to have that underneath. So if I double click on this and let's click on view, So we can see it in Photoshop. This is the texture. And so it's nice and high res, which is necessary because this road is so close to camera. Because if I go into Maya and close this out, then my render cam is really close to the ground. And so since if I was going to render something that's, let's say 1920 by 1080 or 2000 pixels wide, then the texture on the floor here needs to be at least 2000 pixels wide because it's filling the whole frame. It's actually bigger than the frame, which would mean that if I was doing a 2K render, the texture on the floor here would need to be at least 4K wide. And so when I look at this texture in Photoshop and I look at the image size or canvas size, this is 4K by 4K. So I have 4,000 pixels here, which means this is definitely high res enough for me to render up to probably 3,000 pixels wide in Maya and not have the texture get pixelated. So texture resolution is really important to understand. So, but it's, for something like a road, this couldn't be an easier example of how to figure out texture resolution, meaning if you're rendering 2000 pixels wide and your road fills the entire frame at 2000 pixels wide, you need a 2K wide texture. So having a texture that's 4K wide gives me some latitude in render size because my final target output for the highway in the end was 4K. And so technically this texture being 4K wide is a little low res, but with depth of field and all that kind of stuff, it works out. So that's where we are at Save 04. So let's move on and see what happened next. So hopefully you can see that I jump around a lot as I build things. So I'm, also as I've been working on developing all this stuff and making all these DVDs, I'll work on one thing and then move on to something else. And so, but let's go to the next save, which is 05. And I hope this is all interesting on some level. All right, a lot changed in just this one save, meaning that I brought in some grass geometry. And so that's this guy. And so all the geometry that's there, this is stuff that's thoroughly covered in DVD 2 on grass. I've got this leaf geometry, rather these shrubs. That's made with Paint Effects. So that's on a different instancer node. And so I break up my instancer nodes just so that for the grasses, I can have control over the density as well as a different emitter with a different texture. And then for the shrubs, another emitter with another texture, just to break it up with some noise. And then I've brought these bushes in. So the bushes are all onyx. You can see I have a hidden group here called onyx bushes. So let's rewind to frame 1 and let's hide the trees. And let's take a look at these bushes that I brought in. And let's switch to Persp 1. So when you instance stuff onto particles, the original objects that you're instancing onto the particles, you can just go ahead and hide. Sometimes I actually just manually place them around the scene near the camera because they're already in here, might as well use them. But these are the onyx bushes, so I'm going to view selected on that. And so you can see I have some nice variety of leaf size. So you can see some of these bushes have tiny leaves, some of them have larger leaves. Something like that leaf, we can see, or bush, the leaves are sky sensitive. So one of the options I showed you in Onyx. And these all come from Onyx Broadleaf. So again, remember if I go and launch Onyx real quick. If I take a look in Maya and open this up, you'll see it's named Bush 101, Bush 102, Bush 104, Bush 105. That's actually the name of these bushes in Onyx. So if I say load parameters, and I'm in the bush library, so Bush 101 is that one. Bush 102 is that one. So if I load one of these and zoom into it a little bit, we can see just by how long it takes to draw that it's, fairly heavy. And then if we, let's say, tumble a little bit and turn on shading. So here we have a bush that if I go to File, Save Models, OBJ, count is 233,000 polys, but the twigs are obviously really skinny in here, so I would set those to polyline, and that dropped my polygon count down to 130,000 polys, which is totally acceptable. As far as the leaves go on my bushes, you can see that a lot of these leaves, you can see, are just a square. So meaning it's just 2 polygons, which means I set the P objects to 1, but I didn't increase the resolution. While if I look at this one you can see I increased the resolution on it so that the resolution was set to 1, so that I have a little bit of a curve on the leaf, but that ups the polygon count. So since the leaves are bigger, then I felt it was more important that we might notice the lack of curvature if I didn't have any. So the smaller the leaf on a bush, the less likely I'm going to bother. So if we look around in here, we can see like those leaves are a little longer, so they have some curve. And so that's bush 117 that we have right there. So if I go into Onyx and load bush 117, we can see what this guy looks like. So hopefully it's clear why I name things. Like whenever I export and import, I keep those names around, because then if I'm in Maya and I decide I like that bush, I want 4 more of them, but I want them to be a little different, then I know I can go to Onyx and load bush 117, like I've got here, and then just go to the seed value and just mess around with the seed value on all the different parameters. And now I have the same kind of bush, but a little bit different. And then for those leaves, so Save Models OBJ, count, this one's only 12,000 polys. And so since it's so light, I can see, well, the twigs here also should be polyline, but branch 2 and 3 are only 300 and 200 polys, so I might as well leave those as geometry. We're only at 9,000. And then under plates, remember, P objects of 1, I can randomize the scale of the leaves if I want to, and then resolution of 1. You know, it starts getting really heavy if you go high. So usually I don't go higher than 1 unless I know for a fact that this is going to be right in front of the camera. And then maybe I would go higher. And then, you know, it can have a little bit of bend, a little bit of convexity. And now this guy has jumped up to 11,000 polys. So this is a really, really light bush from a geometry perspective. So if I go into Maya, this guy I can see is only 9,000 polys, while something like this one is 4,000. This one is 25,000 because I can see it's got, you know, just a bunch of leaves on it. Kind of a weird looking bush though. This one is 40,000. So compared to trees, the polygon count is relatively low on these guys. And then as far as shaders for them, it's just like trees. You know, it's basically, I use the exact same leaf library that I use for trees on bushes. So the difference is just that they're smaller. But all the same exact settings with the MIA material. So if I go into Hypershade, then each one of these bushes are going to have a shader associated to it. And so if I select one of these bushes, if I select the trunk, I can see this actually just has a MIA material with no textures. It's just got a dark brown color. While the leaves, we can see have one of the leaf shaders, one of the normal leaf shaders with a single leaf. That's it. So if I grab some random other bush's leaf, we can see that has another leaf shader with a different shaped leaf. But if I look at the settings, I can see transparency 0.15, so I lowered the translucency on this guy. Glossiness 0.2, so it's not as shiny. And then I lowered the 90-degree reflection from 1 to 0.8. So it's just, this leaf is a less shiny leaf. It's got lower glossiness. It's a little bit more, it's a thicker leaf, meaning less translucency. It's just breaking up the look of things a little bit to randomize your glossiness, transparency, and 90-degree reflectivity on your leaf shaders, just so that they don't all look the same. So that's Onyx bushes. So I know that while the focus of this DVD from a title perspective is Onyx, it's obviously an overview of how to integrate this stuff into Maya, and Onyx itself is so easy that there's not a lot that I can really talk about in Onyx, because really the best way for you to learn it is to go in and just play with all of these attributes. So what I'm focusing on is showing you the most important attributes, how to export and so forth. Because things like, if I look in here and I see these twigs and I want them to bend more, obviously I can just go to find twigs. There's my twig settings, and I can say, all right, well, my twigs, I want them to curl down a little bit, and I want them to be longer. So now you can see I've got these long drooping twigs. Maybe making them a little shorter. I can randomize the length on them. Twig curving, maybe not so much. There we go. And then on my leaves, maybe go to Phyllotaxy and make them sky sensitive. But maybe I want more density of leaves, so go to leaf density. Right now there's 14 centimeters between each leaf, so I can lower that to 7, and we're going to get a lot more leaves. And then in the options here, pruning, you can randomly remove 50% of the leaves. So pruning means kind of deleting. And yeah, and then my stems in here are only 2 millimeters, so I might as well set it to 0 so that the leaves aren't floating. So if I make the stems really long, then obviously I could go and have the stems curve towards the sky. So you can see I have twigs curving down and stems curving up. Looks goofy, but you get the idea. Or have the stem curve down. So now I've started with one type of bush and very quickly made some changes to create something that's a little bit different. And so in here, from a speed perspective, what's awesome is that I was able to get so much bush variety with Onyx really, really quickly by just going in and exporting each one of these bush presets. So I did probably mess around with them a little bit just to maybe increase the density of the leaves, or to increase or to turn on sky sensitive, which obviously I did on this one because this is bush 103. Although if I go into Onyx and I load bush 103, you can see it's different. So what did I change? I made it sky sensitive and I increased the number of leaves, it looks like. So in here, leaf type, maybe medium instead of small, or maybe I made them large. That's what it looks like. Phyllotaxy, sky sensitive. And now you can see that looks more like what I've got here. So cool. So that's the bushes. So that's really the main thing that changed in this save. So let's move on to the next one, Onyx B06. Onyx B06. And wait for it to load. Close that. Rewind. And hit play. Okay. And so at this point I can see I've made some display layers. So I've got one for the bushes and I've got one for the trees. And so the trees and the bushes are set to bounding box mode on the instancer node. And then looks like what I'm probably doing at this point is, even though it's not that different than the previous save, obviously what I'm focusing on is just tweaking the grass that's at the edge of the road. So meaning adjusting for the grass particle, trying to find the right amount of particles I need for that grass to fill it in and not have a bunch of gaps, while having sort of some breakup on the edge using noise on my ramp. So in the end, you can see I have 15,000 particles for the grass, which is creating a total of 14 million polys just for the grass along the edge of the road. So that's really all that changed in here. So let's go to Onyx B07. 07. So 06. And let's now go by name. And that's the last one. So, and the reason it's the last one is because I started working, since I started really working on this scene file, I kind of could tell like, all right, well, this is becoming a project as opposed to just another bunch of elements for my kit of parts scene. So I made a new project. And I made a project called Highway. So if I go in here now, I'll find Onyx Trees B07. So I just switched to a new project. And so in here you can see that it goes from 07 up to 10. Although for the clean highway, before I added all the ivy and stuff on the ground, that's 08. Meaning I'm basically done at this point once I get to 07. Because 08 is my final for rendering. 09 is just a different camera move. So if you remember, I showed you a couple quick times for this scene. One where we're just pushing in, one where the camera's doing a crane move, moving up, and one where it's kind of racing along the road. And then I can make my highway overgrowth. So let's just take a look at 07. And let that load. Okay. So this looks the same. So as far as what changed at this point, you got me. Let's look in Hypershade. So even if a lot doesn't change, but I still, tweak things for a couple hours on a scene, I'll still save. Every hour or two I save, and I always save with a different number. So sometimes it's not obvious what changed from one to the other. Nothing really seems to be changing with the geometry that's in the scene. So I can tell you what was probably changing is I was doing test renders and just making little tweaks maybe to the shaders, like adjusting glossiness from 0.3 to 0.2, or maybe making a change on, my camera on the exposure photographic node. I can see in here I've got burn highlights high, crush blacks high, my f-stop is at 9. Physical sky is everything is default in here. Except for haze, I increased the haze value to 3, which just makes your sky a little hazier. It adjusts the color of the sky a little bit too, makes things a little bit more yellow, which I liked. So I just increased the haze from the default to 3. The default is either 0 or 1. So that's a very minor change. And then I probably have a camera move in here. So let's see. Let's turn everything off, rewind and hit play. Yeah. So that's probably what changed in this scene is I keyframed the camera. And so just going from a low angle to a high angle. So if we go to the next save, which is 08, this is my final for the highway prior to adding all the stuff on the ground. And so meaning this is the file that I would render from. And so in here, everything's going to be pretty much the same, meaning I've got my camera move. So what I have done is you'll notice that at frame 1, the trees, the bushes, and the grass are all there at frame 1. And so that means that I saved initial state on all of my particles, because as we saw in the earlier scene files, that there's nothing in the scene at frame 1 until I hit play. But every time you hit play, all of your trees and bushes and grass are randomly distributed. And so at a certain point, you want to freeze it so that you can render an animation and have different scene files for different passes and have them all line up correctly. And so once you like the way one of your particle objects looks, then you can just select it. If you want to, let's say, freeze the grass, and go to Dynamics, Solvers, Initial State, Set for Selected. Or if you want to freeze everything, you can just save initial state for all dynamic. And so often I go kind of one at a time as I kind of find, I like the look of them. So I might like hit rewind and play like 10 times until I like the way that Maya has randomly scattered things, and then freeze it. So I have initial state saved on all of these particles. And then, let's see, do I have a cache? I do have a particle disk cache. What that means is you'll notice that, let me change my grasses in here to bounding boxes. And my shrubs, I'll change that to bounding boxes. So, and you'll notice that I can't really scrub because the scene's a little heavy, but I can just click anywhere on the time slider. And so if you know anything about particles, you know that generally you can't do that with particles. If you try and scrub, things will explode unless you create a particle disk cache. So once I know I'm getting ready to render an animation, I will save initial state on all of my particles, and then I will just set my time slider range to the duration of my camera move or animation or whatever, which is 120 frames here, and just say create particle disk cache. And the options, all you do is you give a name for a directory, and just I tell it to cache all my particles. And you hit create. And so what that'll do, like, I can go and call test and hit create, and you'll get a notice just saying your cache directory test is different from your scene name. It's like, well, fine. And then hit OK. And it'll run through the entire animation. And what it's doing is it's writing to disk right now, and the position of every single particle at every single frame. And this is really important for consistency so that you can render across multiple machines and have everything line up correctly. So before you render an animation that has particles in it, you really want to create a particle disk cache. So once that's done, we can see I've got my cache. If I go to solvers, edit, oversampling, or cache settings, you will see use particle disk caches on, and it's using cache directory test from 1 to 120. The cache directory goes into your project directory, into a directory called particles. So if I go real quick and Maya projects highway particles, you can see that I've got that test directory we just created. And if I go to properties on it, I can see it's 700 megs. But whenever I'm done on a project, like done, ready to archive it, put it away, I always know that whatever's sitting in the particles directory, I could always delete, because you can always recache your scene if you need to later, as long as you saved initial state on all of your particles. For static particles for a scene like this. So that's kind of what's changed in this save. So basically, I saved initial state on all my particles, so everything's frozen. I created a particle disk cache, and then I could render. And so if I go real quick and find my projects, highway movies, all right, and I find these quick times. So there's this guy, which is the project or the scene we're looking at, and where the camera just simply rises up. And I did a little bit of post work. We'll talk about After Effects later. So relatively simple. It's got a little bit of fog, glow. And then I've got my next save, which is Onyx Trees 09. And what I did in this one is I took the curve that I used to model my road, and I took it and I moved it up in Y a little bit, and I made it a motion path for a camera. Let me just turn some stuff off in here. So I made a new camera, which is called Camera 1. And since I already had that curve sitting inside here, which perfectly goes along the middle of the road, I just lifted it up a little bit off the road, and then we can see it's just a motion path. So you can see that camera is just flying along the road. And if I look through that camera, then we can see I've got this camera move. So that was just kind of a fun thing to be able to render. So I've got them here. Highway Drive. So in here you can see the post-processing is just a little bit different that I did in After Effects, but similar. I know that if I try and play this one, it's going to play really choppy for you because the camera is moving fairly quick. So I'll just go and sort of scrub through it kind of slowly. So I added motion blur in After Effects, depth of field in After Effects, fog, all that stuff because I rendered for this scene, I rendered my beauty pass, Z-depth pass, fog pass, and was able to then assemble the final look. So that's the highway as far as the clean version of it and how everything was put together. So we're going to look at the next version of it where I added the ivy on the road, and then once we've done that, I can talk a little bit about compositing in After Effects for the final image. So let's move on to highway overgrowth, and that will be our next thing to look at.